So now it is my very, very great pleasure to briefly introduce Dr. Edward Cornwell. Dr. Mallory Williams is going to do a more detailed introduction and speech at the end of Dr. Cornwell's presentation, but Dr. Cornwell has been a mentor for me, and he is stepping down this year from his position as the LaFalle Professor and Chair of Surgery at the Howard University College of Medicine. He has been an incredibly strong supporter of the surgery section, both by his presence, but also by supporting so many students and residents over the last many years to participate in the Drew Walker Resident Research Forum and being an advisor and a mentor to so many of us in the section. So it is my very great pleasure now to turn the podium over to Dr. Edward Cornwell.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Joseph. Can you all hear me and see my screen?
We can, sir.
Thank you so much, Madam Executive Director, to Madam President, Dr. Henry Tillman, and my good friend and colleague, President-elect Dr. Williams. It's a true honor. That's not just lip service. That's a true honor to be able to address this group who's been really part of my life. I attended my first NMA at the age of 6. Now, I didn't get a paper on the program, but the kiddie section was pretty good that year. And so me and my 5 brothers and sisters, my wife, my whole family brings you greetings this evening. That's not just lip service. And so I'm going to hope to draw a parallel in executing my assignment from Dr. Joseph, who said to me, would you please, I said yes, before she even told me, that she said, would you please be willing to address this section? And I said, but of course, but I'm going to try to draw a parallel in executing my assignment of addressing future directions of the surgical section from my perspective between what I hope continues to be the principles of this section to the messages that I give intern applicants coming into my program for over these past 13 years. I always try to share a flavor of the department. I speak of the core mission, which is pursuit of clinical and academic excellence around surgical diseases where outcome disparities exist. And I always go to Charles Drew. And it's important when you talk about history and legacy with folks that are decades younger than you are to be sure that you're walking that line to share not just history, they didn't come for a history talk, but to draw that thread from the legacy and hopefully demonstrate how that provides the fundamentals for your principles and vision going forward. A man who died well before I was born provides the framework through his mantra that everyone that's affiliated with Howard knows: excellence performance will transcend artificial barriers created by man. So I'm going to use that same thread as it relates to what's happened in this section over the NMA, actually 125 years. Formed in 1895 with Daniel Hale Williams, one of the 4 academic surgeons on my Mount Rushmore of those 2 generations coming out of slavery that provided the link of excellence to where we are today. In my opinion, Louis Wright, Daniel Hale Williams, Charles Drew, and Asa Yancey would be those 4. But starting in 1895, 1 year before the Supreme Court validated separate but equal as the law of the land, the NMA under that environment was formed. Of course, the AMA would not have Negro physicians involved. And of course, the founding first vice president was Daniel Hale Williams. The surgical section itself then starts in 1906. And over that time, this section has survived those many decades of Jim Crow, a pandemic, 2 world wars, the whole struggle for civil rights, and the cultural and opportunity changes are immense, obviously. And so in providing you a heartfelt thanks for the opportunity to give my perspectives on future directions, I'm then going to apologize for the personal nature of this. It's going to be a little more first person. I, we, myself, my career, my family, because I cannot in any way express the directions and the history that's brought us here today of the NMA surgical section without sharing personal perspectives of my own career, my own family, indeed my own personal involvement. So I start with really the hero of the NMA in my book. Dr. William Maturi is a 1953 graduate of the Howard University College of Medicine, the president of this section from 1985 to 1988, a long-time executive director of both the NMA and the surgical section, and has a lecture that bears his name. I've had the pleasure of delivering the William Maturi lecture and also the lecture honoring his daughter, my elementary school and high school classmate, Yvette Maturi at Yale. There's an Yvette Maturi lecture. And Dr. Maturi said, until we're no longer able to refer to the less than handful of participants in executive and programming roles of other surgical societies as being the first, I'll come back to this, there will be a need for the NMA and the surgical section. I like some of the comments that were already mentioned about the expanse and the definition of diversity. And so I'm going to start with this thesis that there's no entity that more closely reflects the evolution of my own career, my own life, my own social environment than the NMA surgical section. I'm going to argue that the principles of scientific presentations through our various fora, the opportunities for residents, students, and faculty for career through networking that doesn't exist in other societies, and certainly legally didn't exist in many other societies at the genesis of the NMA. The importance of advocacy that has played an increasing role as we move our sphere of influence beyond the operating room into society at large, and the importance of fellowship and indeed family participation. Principles that are still important, a nuanced sort of modification as it relates to future directions that I'll point out as we move along. This picture of an inflamed gallbladder was a trauma patient. It was in the trauma ICU at shock trauma where I did my residency at a time in 1989 when we gave more TPN than we do now. We used higher levels of PEEP in intubated, critically ill and injured patients than we do now. We gave more blood transfusions than we do now, which activates Hageman-dependent factors in the gallbladders of dogs. And we had a less restrictive, and we were not as aggressive with early enteral feeds and were not aware of its benefits. And therefore, we had more patients then than we do now who are on those things that produce relative visceral ischemia and biliary stasis. And so we saw more of this disease, acalculous cholecystitis. I had a wonderful radiologist at the trauma center by the name of Stuart Mervis there. And with a couple of attendings and Dr. Mervis, we were able to describe the radiographic findings of acute acalculous cholecystitis in critically ill surgical patients. So pericholecystic fluid in the absence of ascites, a thickened gallbladder wall, mucosal slough, and ischemia in the wall. Those findings were present in all 14 of these patients, which are described over a four-year period. They represented 1 out of every 200 patients that were in the ICU shock trauma over that previous 4 years. I thought I would get famous on acalculous cholecystitis. Everything that I mentioned about the risk factors had changed since that time. We give earlier enteral feeds. We give less, we use shorter acting narcotics, fentanyl instead of morphine or Demerol that causes sphincter of Oddi spasm. We don't implement TPN as early and keep patients NPO as long. We give less blood transfusions, and we've gotten away from super PEEP. And so there were more patients with acalculous cholecystitis in that, my first paper, than I've seen in the subsequent 30 years. I thought I was going to get famous on it. If that hadn't changed, I could have been somebody. But acalculous cholecystitis disappeared, and here we are. So I sent the paper to the American Association for Surgery of Trauma. I hadn't heard much about this top surgical society, and I was a little disappointed when it was not accepted. But you know, that year, Dr. Maturi, who I certainly knew, he was my professor in medical school. He kept touch with me during my surgical residency and my fellowship. He was the chair of the surgical section, the director of the Drew Forum. Dr. Charles Drew the chair of the surgical section from 1946 to 1949, premature tragic death in 1950. The surgical forum that bears his name started in 1953. Matthew Walker becomes the chair of the surgical section 54, 55, and his name is added. So there was this thing that I hadn't heard of when I was a resident at USC called the Drew Walker Forum. And the head of the Drew Walker Forum was the chair of the Department of Surgery right across town from where I was a resident at LA County, Art Fleming. Dr. Fleming invited me. Where was this surgical forum? Where was the Drew Walker Forum in the NMA in 1988 when I was starting as a fellow at Shock Trauma? In LA. And so I had an opportunity to give my first talk at the surgical section of the National Medical Association meeting in Los Angeles in 1988. And I would add that the fact that Art Fleming, who I had not met before that point, gave that invitation to me and allowed me to give my first talk, just spurred me on, so that when I was a faculty member at Howard, yes, but also at USC and at Johns Hopkins, I brought along students and residents who had the opportunity to present before this section. And so Dave Chang, who had been a medical student, a master's of public health, and a researcher with me both at Hopkins and at Howard, presented. We had Hopkins students presenting at the surgical section at NMA, white Hopkins students, residents, as a matter of fact. Some may remember Sky Mayo, and certainly some of you will remember an outstanding medical student that co-authored this paper with me on who had the incredibly innovative vision that she shows today, that she showed tonight, as we evaluated a violence prevention outreach program at Johns Hopkins. That's right, the young Erica Sutton, who was a co-author on this paper. And so I'm glad that she also had one of her early presentation opportunities through the same surgical forum. So scientific forum, the Drew Walker Forum, the opportunities to enhance your career through presenting at that forum, hearing senior surgeons then give you a local critique, tough love, was very important to my career. And I will tell you, I certainly hope that will continue to be the directions. I certainly intend to continue to participate in that. But remember, for over 150 years now, we had occasional medical students of color going to medical schools in the upper Midwest and the Northeast. Louis Wright went to Harvard. Charles Drew went to Canada to go to medical school. Asa Yancey, as I mentioned, was at the University of Michigan. Daniel Hale Williams went to medical school in Chicago. And so they needed opportunities beyond medical school to the larger and the later hurdle. All of these students went to medical schools, were one of a few in majority institutions, but frequently they were not invited to train at the hospital, despite their excellence, because they were not going to give orders to white nurses and take care of white women in those hospitals. And so all of them had to get training opportunities where? At Freedman's Hospital. So Dr. Drew's dedication to his students and his residents span not only beyond the bedside, but the opportunity to pursue advancing residency positions for them and their trainees. So when I see this photo from our own Howard University of Dr. Drew on your far right over here with his faculty and trainees, I think of a lot of things. I think of the traditional oral history that we have given, going back well into the early days of slavery. My wife and I are grandchildren of Southern Baptist ministers, and the nuanced importance that we now put that in our written history, I'll elaborate in a second, and our video history. So when I talk about Dr. Drew and his residents and the student that was sitting on the front row of the last lecture he ever gave, March 31st, 1950, Dr. LaFall, and Dr. LaFall, over 55 years on the faculty, sharing with students the story of what Dr. Drew did in the last 24 hours of life, and him being in the front row on April 1st, Saturday morning, 1950, when the message came into his pharmacology lecture that the chair of surgery had died tragically. It's important to me that that's no longer just oral history. And now we have that in video. I've captured that in video. We have it in a book that Dr. LaFall has authored that the president of our university, Wayne Frederick, former president of this section, and myself co-authored. I think it's important now that we capture that so we understand the foundations, not just to live in history, so we understand the foundations of excellence that really springboard us today. So when I look at this photo today, I think about Dr. Drew. Dr. LaFall sat with me in 2017. That's going to be 68 years after this photo was taken in 1949. And looking at these 20 surgeons, Dr. LaFall was able to name 19 of those 20 surgeons. Almost 70 years later, he could name them. And he figured out that the photo was from 1949 because Jack White, who graduated in 49 from the program, was not in the photo, and Jesse Barber is in the photo, and he was an intern in 1949. I tell the story to my own faculty and students and residents in my program that, you know, when I looked at this, I've looked at that photo for years before I realized that that was Dr. Barber. He was a professor of mine when I was a medical student. Dr. Barber, I never knew him to have hair. He was a big, gruff, balding chair of neurosurgery. We respected him. We kind of afraid of him. I took Joy Barber to my senior prom. I got Joy Barber home on time from the senior prom, I might add. So there's Dr. Barber there, but also more importantly, there's Dr. Sam Bullock, a faculty member in the Department of Surgery. Dr. John Ford right here, who I interviewed in 2004 when he was in his 80s, Cardiff by the Sea. He was the only graduate in the class of 1947, Loma Linda. Did a year at LA County as an intern as Loma Linda graduating class did. I didn't know that. When I came through LA County in the 80s, I was a fourth surgical resident. I had never heard of John Ford until many years later. And Dr. Walter Johnson, an orthopedic resident. Where was Dr. Drew going? It wasn't just about his medical students. It was about opportunities for his resident. In those days, in the 40s and 50s, you had to cobble out clinical opportunities, as he himself had in Montreal and Columbia University Hospital, not only from his clinical research, but where he had a clinical lab at Freedman's Hospital. And so he was going down to where? To Tuskegee, Alabama, to the John Andrews Clinic, a presentation with forum just like we have for opportunities and for a job from his most celebrated surgical resident, Dr. Asa Yancey. And Dr. Yancey, who was born in 1916, on the occasion of his 100th birthday, I thought it was important to publish in the Bulletin of the American College of Surgeons, bring to life Dr. Yancey and all that he meant. This man who grew up in Atlanta was a valedictorian in his graduating class of 1937 at Morehouse, who goes to University of Michigan College of Medicine and was part of this historic class. That's a big deal to have 4 Negroes graduating in the class of 1941 at University of Michigan. They weren't the first. Indeed, Dr. Yancey's brother, Dr. Bernice Yancey, was a graduate in the class of 1930, 11 years his senior. And what happened to Bernice Yancey? Of course, he wasn't going to train at the University of Michigan Hospital after graduating that class. He had really about only 7 or 8 opportunities in 1930 where he trained. And so he went to Negro Hospital number 2 in St. Louis, and handling in the summer of 1930 faulty x-ray equipment in that hospital, he got electrocuted and died. Someone who beats the odds, comes out of segregated Atlanta, goes to University of Michigan Medical School, a brilliant musician, built radios in his house, was brilliant by every description. And that tragic death led a Black attorney in St. Louis who was already lobbying on improved facilities in that hospital. Y'all said separate but equal. That attorney's name was Homer G. Phillips, and that hospital would be very important in the training of physicians and surgeons over about a 50-year period in our history. And so Asa Yancey, as well on your far left there, as well as Martin Sutler and C. Waldo Scott. Now that you're in Virginia, Dr. Joseph, you'll get to know the congressman from Virginia. And in the Norfolk area, Dr. Britt's congressman is Bobby Scott, long-term congressman. And C. Waldo Scott is a spitting image of his father, Bobby Scott, the congressman from Virginia. So Those three men all come to Freedman's and have part of their training under the legendary Charles Drew. The woman, interestingly, is the oldest granddaughter of Maggie Walker. Her name is Maggie Walker, same name as her grandmother, who was the first African-American female bank president, also a Virginian, and she would have a long career in pediatrics in Chicago. And so this was what our environment was like. Dr. Drew's vision was clear. Opportunities for his young men, they were all men then, his trainees, to go out to other facilities after their training in the South and forge a more complete society. Dr. Yancey would go to Tuskegee. He'd first get further pelvic training at Meharry, and he would create a landmark operation. Right? Dr. Sutler would do some training at Howard in thoracic surgery, return to Cleveland, and C. Waldo Scott would return to Virginia, and all of these men forged the increased opportunities for residents that would follow them. But it was the travel to Tuskegee Institute where Asa Yancey was the chief of surgical services from 1948 to 1958. The Ku Klux Klan was not happy when that VA hospital down there was created in the 1920s. But here was Dr. Yancey leading a program in the Deep South that trained surgeons of color for 10 years in Alabama, and then moves to 1958, fulfilling a dream that his mentor would never live to see. He comes back to Atlanta, to Grady Hospital, which then was still segregated, and worked at the adjacent Spalding Pavilion. Ultimately would integrate Emory's Department of Surgery and be a chief medical officer there at Grady for over 20 years, and published in where? The Journal of the National Medical Association. This operation, this modified disease, this modified operation for what we now call Hirschsprung's disease, congenital megacolon, where instead of just doing a perineal resection and a permanent colostomy for these children, stripping and teasing out the mucosa and submucosa from the seromuscular sleeve and passing the more distended but innervated, more proximal colon down through that seromuscular sleeve and fashioning a perineal anastomosis. Performed the operation in a 6-year-old child. She survived the operation, would later die the next year of a garden variety standard small postoperative small bowel obstruction, and he published that journal, that paper in the Journal of the National Medical Association in 1952. Look at the co-author, that resident, the last surviving member of that crash in 1950. Dr. Ford would live well into the 2000s. But he was a co-author with Dr. Yancey of that paper 12 years before Dr. Suave would publish the paper. And most surgeons in America, colorectal surgeons, pediatric surgeons, to this day calls that the Hirschsprung's disease, the Suave operation for Hirschsprung's disease. And I tell our residents this story every year. And one year was kind of cute. One intern raised her hand and she said, "Well, Dr. Cornwell, isn't there a society that can correct these things?" I say, "Yeah. You sitting in the meeting of the society, Grand Rounds at Howard University. If you all don't tell that story, who do you think will?" And so the college itself, through its history of surgery, has now has some of their history of surgery publications that document that this procedure should be called the Yancey procedure. But as I come back to Dr. Drew, his dedication was not just of his residents and his attendings. You'll see two of his successors there. The Drew Syphax is our named lecturer of their year. There's Dr. Burke Syphax, who was in that first intern class in 1936, went to Howard undergrad and medical school, did his training there, Freedman's Hospital, went off to Rochester, New York at Strong Memorial, as with all surgeons in the spirit of Mordecai Johnson. We wanted in all of our professions, all of our dedicated Negro professionals to go off somewhere else and then come back to the capstone. Dr. Syphax is a future chair in this chair from 1957 to 1970. After Drew's tragic death, Joseph R. Lowry, a head of the surgical section from 55 to 57, was chair of the Department of Surgery from 1950 to 1955. And then Dr. Clarence Green, the first African-American board-certified neurosurgeon, chair of the Department of Surgery from 55 to 57 before Dr. Syphax. His premature death, you see the cigarette in his hand, he died of a cerebral hemorrhage himself. So Dr. Syphax was the chair, but Drew was dedicated to his students. And this young, precocious 19-year-old sophomore medical student was in the front row, as he was, as the number one ranked student of this class, almost didn't get interviewed talking about dedication to our young people. Almost didn't get interviewed. His university president lobbied his counterpart, Mordecai Johnson, to talk to the dean of the medical school for Dr. LaFall and his classmate, George Rawls, to get an interview coming out of Florida A&M. They got the interview. They got admitted. Where did they finish in the class of 52? Number 1 and number 2. Dr. LaFall, head of the surgical section, 1970, 1971. His classmate, George Rawls, head of the surgical section, 1971 to 1972. Of these several men who are only surpassed by my father in terms of impact on my life. Indeed, when I would study in my little dorm room for 3 years at LA County Hospital, this was the index card that sat on the wall above where I would read, equanimity under duress, a hallmark, Dr. LaFall said, of surgical discipline. And so all of these men, head of the surgical section, having their students present there was linked to what they were doing in their own institutions. In the 150-year history of our College of Medicine, now 153-year history, and in our department, there's only been a period from January 2008 until Dr. Syphax's death in July of 2010, the only time period that we had 4 living chairs. And so, as I said before, the legacy is important, but recording this in our written word and now in our video presentations is even more important, because we all have now that mortality. I'm thrilled by hearing those stories over these many years. But this is literally the 3 men who were chairs of the Department of Surgery for my entire lifetime, 1957 to 1970, Dr. Syphax, 1970 to 1995, Dr. LaFall, and Dr. Callender, 1996 to 2008, until I became the chair in January of 2008, coming up on my 13th year. So I take no credit for the stability of our Department of Surgery after the premature deaths and step-downs of Doctors Drew, Lowry, and Green, but it's these 3 men. And I just hope there's something in the water of the department for the longevity of these men. Dr. LaFall died 3 days after his 89th birthday. Dr. Syphax died in July, just 4 months shy of his 100th birthday. And Dr. Callender is still active in our department well past his 80th birthday. And so my perspective on our future directions is scientific fora, but using our journal, which was not peer-reviewed for many years, now is a tool for promotion of our faculty, career opportunities, now not limited to 7 or 8 hospitals, but hospitals all over the land. Our mentoring need not come. The days of best Black this or that are long over. Our dedication to those artificial barriers are not now sanctioned segregation by gender, race, and ethnicity, but by access of our patients. And so in our own hospital, we thought it was important that our services reflect the name of those pioneers within our hospital, and all who were present, who were, as I've mentioned, led the surgical section. So the Syphax service, him being known as master of the abdomen, is where we have our minimally invasive bariatric surgical patients and colorectal patients. The LaFall service, Dr. LaFall being the second African-American fellow trained at Memorial Sloan Kettering, growing out of a relationship between Dr. Drew and Alan O'Father Whipple that led to Dr. White being the first and Dr. LaFall being the second. Dr. Matori, the first African-American member of the American Association for the Surgeon of Trauma, for the Surgery of Trauma. And in my opinion, one of the most influential non-chair faculty in the 150-year history of our department. And Dr. Callender, the Callender service was the transplant service. The acute care surgical service is called the Matori service. Surgical oncology service is the LaFall service. And so I I still talk about the importance of these towards careers. But now let's talk a little more about diversity and what it means. Someone mentioned gender diversity. I'm going to digress a little bit and share with you an important photo. This is a photo of the Society of Black Academic Surgeons, an inaugural meeting in April of 1989 at Duke. It's hanging on my wall in the office where I'm sitting right now. This becomes more precious with each passing year. 10 of these 30 surgeons have passed in this 31 years since this photo. There's 31 people in this photo. This woman, Dr. Anya Aquari's cousin, was a lab tech. She's not a surgeon. And so there's 30 surgeons, no women, 1989. Let me share a photo with you 27 years later. And by the way, you see how historic it is. Dr. Art Fleming, who gave me that first opportunity, president of this section, 1994 to 96. Anya Aquari, who was the surgical section chair right around that same time, the year after I presented, and who I wrote my first chapter with, 1990 to 1992. Eddie Hoover, who took me under his wing when I went up for a weekend for my brother's wedding in Buffalo, had me spend a day in his department talking about what societies you need to join, what papers. Let's look and see what you're writing about. There's my colleague, Dave Jacobs, who's on the wall. We were both fellows together at Shop Trauma, and there's Asa Yancey. Dr. Yancey, and here's Mitchell Spellman, probably the only surgeon who was in that photo with Dr. Drew in 1949, and here in this photo 40 years later. And you see Dr. Claude Organ, Dr. Organ's son, Brian Organ. My colleague, Steve Stain, was a year behind me. Both of us still in training, Vernon Henderson, Haile DeBas. And so look at this, 30 surgeons, all men. 27 years later, now there's probably a 27-year-old intern in this photo who was born a few months around the time of that photo that I just showed you. Ohio State, 27 years later, I had to count about 8 times. This is about 135 surgeons, 67 women, almost exactly half of these a generation later. You see this, you see the presidents, you see some future presidents, some leaders in our own institute, in my own institution and our section. You gotta get this person right here down here, our executive director. And so it takes, I've had conversations with this internally and publicly within my own institution. Took me 13 years through promotions at University of Southern California, Johns Hopkins, to go from assistant to full professor of surgery. I was not promoted at Howard. And so we need these national fora, like the surgical section of NMA, to be important through the peer-reviewed publications of our journal, the national presentations of our section that will help advance the careers of these young surgeons. And so I share this to give some perspective, particularly for those who are listening to me who are under the age of 40. As I think about how long it takes, to create a surgical intern, and from that to create a professor of surgery, and from that to have the national impact that your committees are looking for as we move through promotions. I'm going to digress to the only thing. I get fascinated. I interview students, and I was fascinated listening to the conversation about it. I get a chance to talk to them and meet and greets on Thursday afternoons, and then interview on Friday mornings, and it's incredible the breadth of experience that they have. The only thing I had was some surgical knowledge, a little bit knowledge about history and sports, and so I'm going to give you a sports analogy about changing the culture and what 10 or 20 years means. This is May of 1965. My father took me to the DC Armory to the closed circuit telecast. I asked my 93-year-old mother frequently, how did you let Daddy take me to that? That was not consistent with the rules of the household. Fights then were on like Monday nights, 7 years old, late night, closed circuit, DC Armory. This was a 1-minute fight. The rematch between Cassius Clay, known in some small circles as Muhammad Ali, and Sonny Liston. Cassius Clay had beat him 15 months earlier in February of 1964 at Miami Beach. The rematch was pushed off. There was rumors that he had some now connections to Nation of Islam. Indeed, he did. Malcolm X was his friend. Malcolm was killed just 3 months before this fight, this rematch. Malcolm was at ringside in that February 1964 fight. But let me call your attention. I've shared this with my son when he wrote a paper about sports and society. And I think this name one of the great sports photos in the 20th century. You could write a thesis about race relations in America. You can't tell the story of race in America without telling the story of Muhammad Ali, who brought races together. But in 1965, look at the faces of the supposedly neutral journalists. Two black pugilists, the one on the ground while Ali's saying, get up, on a 1-minute knockout. Jersey Joe Walcott, the ref, is nowhere around because he's running off to talk to the editor of Ring Magazine. He didn't know what he was doing. It's a long count. And then he runs back to direct Ali to his neutral corner. But this famous Neil Leifer Sports Illustrated shot captured so much. Look at the expressions on the face of some of the cameramen, the expression of shock on some of the journalists. Larry Merchant, some of you boxing fans will remember Larry Merchant on HBO Boxing. He did that for decades. Look at the look of shock on the young Larry Merchant's face. Why would they be in such shock that this pugilist is on the ground? He had a darker complexion. He was a sullen in his public expressions. He didn't speak as assertively and as clearly as the young Cassius Clay. When I hear the young Cassius Clay talk, I hear the dialect of Dr. LaFall. He tries to be too pretty. He holds his hands too low when I hear him talk. And yet, why would they prefer that this person win? Why would they be so shocked and outraged at the victor of this 1960 Olympian, a product of a two-family home, taught to box by a white police officer, had white businessmen who were managing him over this convicted felon, one of 17 children, son of a sharecropper, who beat him, who left home as a 14-year-old, who was always in trouble with the law, who ultimately would be found in a hotel room with a needle in his arm, who was thought to have mob connection, who, when he fought Floyd Patterson in 1962, Floyd Patterson got a call from President Kennedy. Because in the 1960s, when my father took me to this closed circuit, it wasn't about Super Bowls. There was no Super Bowl or NBA or Major League. The top 3 sports in America: horse racing, college football, World Series. The fourth would be boxing. And so this was a big deal. Look at that in May of 1965. Look at the expressions on the face. All of that stuff that I said about this pugilist was trumped, that this young, well-spoken, assertive black man would actually be, to mainstream American, mainstream white America, would be more of a threat because he had the audacity to be loud and proud. So compare that to the photo 9.5 years later in Kinshasa, Zaire. I remember that night too. I walked with my buddies down to the Civic Center at Providence. We bought tickets to that closed circuit. I left Horse, working class town, predominantly white folks in the Civic Center. The 6 of us talking trash and asked him to get off the ropes, and we couldn't believe it when he won. Our jubilation matched the jubilation of the whites and the black Africans in and around that ring in Kinshasa, Zaire, October 1974. Compare those 2 photos and compare the change of culture as it relates to race and culture in America, the reaction to Muhammad Ali. Look at this quote: 25 years, change of culture. Gene Stallings is the head coach of Texas A&M football. And being asked why his was an all-white team, he said, to accomplish our goals, we have to fight, sweat, pull together, sacrifice, pull in the same direction. I don't believe we can do that, he said in Sports Illustrated in 1967, with a Negro on the team. 25 years later, who won the NCAA champion? The University of Alabama. Who was the coach? Gene Stallings. He had 11 black starters on defense. I guess he still believed in segregation. It's just that he don't want it all blacks in. And so the culture changes dramatically over 10 years, over 25 years, over 27 years. And so it does in us when we apply opportunities across barriers, those opportunities across diversity of thought, diversity of gender, diversity of ethnicity, and diversity of the institutions where our mentors come from. We still have to be a section that promotes advocacy. The NMA surgical section published a position paper in the Journal of the AMA. And being in DC as I am, we have an added advantage of the proximity and having the opportunity to be in that audience when President Obama introduced his Affordable Care Act. And being an interim dean, time was right when he chose to come to Howard. And so had the opportunity to share this. And that was a memorable day for our medical student as well. And so our opportunities for advocacy have only grown. I think it's still an important principle. The nuance is we kind of popular now. You know, a medical student reached out to me and I told her that that George Floyd photo was going to be her generation's Emmett Till. And I will close with a couple comments about what makes us distinct: fellowship and family participation. I remember that long ride with me and 5, and my youngest brother wasn't born, me and 4 of my siblings, and Miss Thomas, who worked in our house. We weren't allowed to say maid when I was growing up, but Miss Thomas was part of the family as we drove to Chicago to that first NMA I'd ever attended with the family section. It was important for me, and to those of you that are raising families, as you come every summer. I've been at every NMA meeting from that 1988 where I presented all the way for the next 30 up through 2018. And so it's important. Now, in 1977, we drove cross country, and my father and sister flew to meet us. It was a little too much togetherness to take a motor home for him. But me and my brother and sister did the driving. We were headed to the surgical section in Los Angeles, 1977, when my father presented a photo. I keep this photo in my office. He was stout and hearty. I like to remember him that way. I remember the 1983 surgical section meeting. It was in Chicago. I was an intern. I just left a big case, first retrohepatic cava case, a patient that didn't survive, and I had to go to speak to the patient's family as an early PG2 in August. I almost quit surgery that day, but I had to go to the surgical section where my father was given an award at the Howard University Medical Alumni Banquet, 1983. So we had known by 3 years, and hopefully that looks like a joyous picture to you all. It's a little bittersweet for me because we had learned in April that he had pancreatic cancer. This is the last photo in my family that I use publicly because even in my sister's eyes, which you all hopefully see as a pleasant smile, there's a little sadness. I see sadness that others may not see. And so he got that alumni award. When I look back, my father was 60 years old then, and he would be dead in 7 months. He lectured to me on pancreatic cancer as a medical student rotating on surgery, and in retrospect, he probably had pancreatic cancer himself. But our trip to the 1977 surgical section was for his presentation on Crohn's disease. And so all of my siblings have grown up in this surgical section. My mother has kept the fire burning. He's passed the torch to her, and so she insisted we all do well, and so we did. Michael, my baby brother, has presented in this section. The 2 of us, he went to Yale, and as I did, went to Howard Med School. My sister Patty, brother David, both went to Georgetown Law School. Sister Brenda went to Wharton, got her MBA. You know, the real Wharton, not that undergraduate degree from Penn like your president talks about Wharton. I'm talking about the real Wharton, an MBA. And so we've carried that torch on, and all of us have fond memories of the surgical section, which I would say to you all, I hope that those of you, if you're like me, and because of your profession, your opportunities for your children, you choose to send them to the very best schools you can, and perhaps maybe they're one of a few in their classes. I was obsessed that my son's student teacher meetings always saw me, and all of his events saw me, because during his middle school at McDonough High School, there were some times when he and Josh Richardson were the only 2 black boys in the class. And so this meeting, when he was 10 years old, a few months after this, is when I dragged him to his first surgical section. I wanted him to see the kids of black professionals. I didn't like what I was seeing on popular images about what was being defined as black, as I kind of made my way through discussions about the risk factors for violence in our youth. And so I dragged him kicking and screaming at that meeting in Orlando to his first kiddie section. I remember I gave a talk and I said, now I'm going to run off and go back to my room to make sure my son is awake because he got to go off to the kiddie section before I came back to sit on the panel. At the end of that meeting, he said, Dad, can we go next year? After I dragged him kicking and screaming and going to that one. I said, of course. Well, the next year, the meeting was in Washington, D.C. So I'd immediately say, yeah, you can go. But for the next 6 or 7 meetings in New Orleans, in Toronto, he would go. And as a brother grew and his athletics participation grew, that's not high school graduation, that's 8th grade graduation. It became hard. I couldn't drag the brother away from his practices. And I'll remember very well the meeting in 2014. His 2013 football team, his junior year, is one of the best high school football teams I'd ever seen. They were undefeated, beat Gilbert by 5 touchdowns. And here we were, he still wanted to go to the kiddie program at the age of 17. The last programs for 16 to 18. I said, man, if you try to keep going, they're going to arrest you. You showing up 6'3", 190-pound receiver. So we had to leave the NMA early. He went to the Sunday, Monday, Tuesday morning. We caught a flight all the way back so he could be the Wednesday afternoon practice, saying he wanted, well, let me go late, Dad, to practice. Listen, come on, man, you're a captain. You're one of the best players returning on the team. Let's go back. And so the surgical section is a big deal for him. So I close with that as I hope future directors, one thing that sets us apart from all of our scientific meetings is the fellowship and the involvement of our kids, perhaps the next generation members of future surgical succession. Now, I played a little hip hokey last year, Dr. Joseph. I didn't attend. I have an excuse. I have a letter from my doctor. I took a sabbatical for a year. I got a new hip on July 29th, just a few days before your section meeting. Mike went to Maryland, played for 4 years, graduated with a year of eligibility, transferred to Howard. There's our photo when he transferred to Howard. It was a great sabbatical year. I'm pain-free. We got to travel to all of his games. He caught a touchdown pass in Soldiers Field against Hampton in Chicago, caught this touchdown pass in Harvard. Dr. Williams, I'd never been to Harvard Stadium. Even after 4 years at Brown, I'd never been to a football game at Harvard Stadium. So that was a big deal, and there's him celebrating a little bit more than he used to. And so it's been a wonderful year away. I'm back. I'm sold in. I'm not going anywhere. I'm still going to do what I love to do, which is teach and train and operate on critically ill and take care of critically ill and injured patients, and really attack our outcomes research imperative with new vigor. But I want to close with this. Not everybody that's been involved in the training of Black surgeons have been heavily involved in the surgical section. I have another talk that I'll give someday. I've been developing this theme of the W.E.B. Du Bois approach in the first 2 generations coming out of slavery versus the Booker T. Washington approach. Understandable different approaches when you compare that with a former slave, with that who lived free in Massachusetts for much of his life. But Louis Wright is on my Mount Rushmore. Born in Atlanta in 1891, went to Clark College, went to Harvard Medical School, and did his training at Freedman's Hospital, and was decorated and published on the Schick test for diphtheria, dispelling a myth about it not being valid in Negro skin. But we don't see Louis Wright as a leader of the surgical section. Dr. Drew's contemporary. There's some thought that he was, because Louis Wright, even though his father was a slave, Louis Wright needed to get out of Atlanta. You know, when he comes back after being educated at Harvard and going to World War I, and he's working with his stepfather in Atlanta in his practice, and a white man called him a nigger, Louis Wright tried to choke him. So you knew Louis Wright had to get out of Atlanta. So his career was in New York. He integrated Harlem Hospital, where Black and white patients were being seen. I talked to Ken Davis and Leon Dent about Harlem Hospital and the number of Black surgeons trained in that hospital. This is a remarkable photo in the late 1940s. Those are white surgeons. And that woman is the first African-American female surgeon who did open heart surgery. Myra Logan trained, and the boss was the Black man. You will not see another photo, integrated photo, at a hospital that's predominantly white with a Black man as boss in the 1940s. And that's a remarkable photo. Louis Wright and his leadership of Harlem Hospital, its impact with trainees. Some thought that he was definitely against the creation through the Rosenwald Foundation of a separate integrated hospital in Harlem. No question about that. He said, no, we're going to get the best trainees that we can get here. and some thought he was hostile to graduates of Howard and Meharry. That debate moves on. But Dr. Harold Freeman was a head of this surgical section, 1983, 1985, and led that program after Louis Wright. But Myra Logan, if we don't include her, will slip into the annals of history. Not a lot of people know about her, including some thoracic surgeons of color. Aubrey Maynard, I gave the Maynard lecture and didn't know him until I was invited to give that Maynard lecture down in Atlanta by Dr. Weaver. Dr. Maynard stayed quiet about who was actually doing the operation on September 20th, 1958, when Martin Luther King was stabbed by a deranged white woman. They were looking for Dr. Wright, and the Filipino and the Black thoracic surgical fellows working in a Harlem hospital prepared Dr. King, waited for Dr. Maynard to come in, and this photo has all of them involved in that operation where they did a thoracotomy and removed that blade out of his chest and mediastinum under direct vision. Dr. Fred Kaysen brought Dr. John Cordes to the surgical section meeting in New York. I'm sure Dr. Cordes thought he saw Dr. Maynard live 98 years. Dr. Cordes must have thought Dr. Maynard was never going to die. Doctor is only on the in 2008, on the 50th anniversary, did Dr. Cordes tell his story publicly about him and Dr. Niclero. But Dr. Kaysen, a historical maven himself, knew about that. And so I close by saying that our mentors and our mentees come from all institutions, majority, minority. Dr. Claude Organ was the chair of surgery at Creighton when I first got to know him. And when I would sit with him, when I would arrive at every NMA, he would hold court with me. That was an amazing opportunity. And so I hope our future directions are cognizant of the fact that we are spreading our wings all throughout this great land and from all over the planet. That's where my applicants are coming from. As long as they bring skill set and interest to that theory of excellence to performance, transcending artificial barriers, and in my own department, pursuit of clinical and academic excellence around surgical diseases where outcome disparities exist, that will be, from my perspective, the future directions of the National Medical Association and the additional laying down of a historical framework for those that follow us. Again, it's been a sheer joy to be able to participate on this. It's 3 decades and counting, and I feel good, energetic, and I'm anxious for what lays ahead. Thank you, colleagues. It's been a great pleasure.
Thank you, Dr. Cornwell. And I'm overwhelmed a bit. And this is probably a good time then for me to turn it over to Dr. Mallory Williams, who always knows the right thing to say.
That's funny, Kim. Listen, it is a sheer pleasure for me to acknowledge the contributions of Edward Eugene Cornwell III. As we enter a phase of American surgery, particularly African-American surgery in this country, where we are forced to begin to say goodnight to our sweet princess, those who are of my vintage must recognize that the Stephen Staines, the Edward Cornwell, as they enter into the evening of their careers, will have been the bridge tenders for our careers. They will have been the generation that integrated American surgery and took on positions in American surgery that up until that time, no one else of their hue occupied, thus providing the light for us to think or believe that we could do the same. We must start with the sheer fact that he is the son of a FAMU graduate who's an AKA. That's always a good beginning. And to know his mother is to understand his keen understanding of humanity and his wit that underlies that. God bless Maggie. As we watch Michael, we do it from heated seats. He began his academic pursuits at the Sidwell Friends School in DC. This is a place where princes begin, surely, and princesses, Yvette Matory. He then did his undergraduate education at the Brown University in Providence, Rhode Island. From Providence, he comes back to DC to Howard University to do his medical degree. And then from Howard University, he would go to the West Coast, where he would train in general surgery as one of the first few African-American surgical residents at the University of Southern California. He finished up there and do his fellowship training in trauma at the Maryland Institute for Emergency Medical Services. And then he would come back and start his junior faculty career at Howard University College of Medicine, only to go back to USC and finish his junior faculty career there. A little bit peripatetic, but purposeful. He would take the job, a historic job at the Johns Hopkins institutions, to become chief of trauma, where he would become the associate professor and chief of trauma at what was that time the Center of American Surgery. If we count the chairs across the country, there's no doubt that Hopkins has imprinted itself on the map of American surgery. And he would spend a decade at Hopkins. And for those of us who went to the University of Maryland for any role in medical education, be it medical school or residency training, we know that when we think of Johns Hopkins University and Black professors that were surgeons, you may think of Levi if you knew him. He also would hold a beautiful court at the surgical section meetings, one to behold and one to just cherish. You may know of our current Secretary of HUD, Housing and Urban Development. But the third Black professor at that institution in surgery would be Edward Eugene Cornwell III. And then the call would come once again to come home to take the chairmanship and become the LaSalle Doheny LaFall Jr. Professor of Surgery and chair of a department for over 10 years now. No easy task. His boss was Don Wilson. But more than that, he would be succeeding two giants. One, immediately, Clive O'Callaghan, one of the most long-term holders of NIH funding in American surgery as an African-American academic. The other, Dr. LaFall himself, one of the most beloved surgeons, be you black, white, red, green, brown, in American surgery. And what did he do? He created one of the most admired research programs in outcome disparities in the country through the Clive O'Callaghan Outcomes Research Center. Over 200 personal publications himself. By now, thousands of citations from everyone who has participated in that academic development process. And more than that, imprinted a surgical literature on the truths that existed in our care in America as it relates to Black and brown patients, truths that no editorial board is rushing to publish. But beyond that, he created equity. It always intrigues me when we talk about women in surgery, and I don't see Edward Eugene Cornwell on the panel session. His residency has 60% women of color who have graduated. That's something to be proud of. His department has 3 extramurally acknowledged centers of excellence. One trauma center by the American College of Surgeons. The second one led by Terrence Fulham, who I believe is here tonight on this call, the Bariatric Center. And the third, again, by the American College of Surgeons, Dr. Dean Ford is on this call tonight. She leads that. This is what the Department of Surgery has produced under his leadership at Howard. What has he done professionally as a bridge tender in surgery for us all who are striving and seeking to continue the tradition of Drew in American surgery? Well, He has served on the board of managers for the AAST. He's been secretary of the American College of Surgeons. And probably some would even say more important than all that, he's been chair of the membership committee of the American Surgical. Quite a distinguished list of positions in American surgery as he chooses to depart to just an
Mallory, you muted yourself.
But nevertheless, quite a distinguished list of positions in American surgery. And so it is my high honor on behalf of our chair to present the award that he has in his office. I traveled today, so I'm not with him personally, but he has it. To Edward Eugene Cornwell, the LaSalle Doheny LaFall Junior Professor and Chair of Surgery at the Department of Surgery at Howard University, the Howard University Hospital Surgeon in Chief for his academic and his clinical achievements in trauma and critical care, specifically for his research achievements as well in surgical disparity science, and perhaps most importantly and definitely most endearing to my heart, for being the keeper of our most sacred history. This acknowledgement tonight, and I say thank you.
Well, listen, my friend, Dr. Joseph, I am humbled and now a bit nervous, because usually when you get those kind of plaudits, you're sitting in a casket. So it's wonderful to have that kind of, this is a beautiful plaque. First of all, thank you, my friend, Dr. Williams. Thank you, Dr. Joseph. Thank you, Dr. Henry Tillman, who have all signed this beautiful plaque that's going to be hanging in this office where I sit. It's going to be to the left. That's the family photos behind me. So it's going to be right here to the left. And, you know, he tipped his hand. I was surprised when one of the ladies in the front office brought this by yesterday. And so that's why I knew I had to dress up, you know, with the, you know, coat and tie. And I'm not even wearing the gym shorts I usually wear when I'm doing these Zoom meetings. So I got a whole suit on today. And thank you all so much. It's just an awesome plaque and a wonderful evening that I will rush to share with my family. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Dr. Cornwell. And thank you, Dr. Adams, Dr. Washington, and Dr. Sutton for providing us with the historically Black medical institution perspective on this tragedy that we are facing now, this challenge. I won't say tragedy, I'll say challenge that we're facing now. Dr. Cornwell, you talked about what the surgical section has been through in the last 100+ years, and you mentioned the pandemic. And it took me a second before I realized you were talking about the 1918 pandemic. Yes. And that we are now in another pandemic. And yes, so we came through that first one, the world wars, the variety of others, some might say smaller wars. I'm not sure we can really say that, but the changes in our society, and we have prevailed and will continue to prevail. And as was mentioned in the chat, we need to honor our heroes while they can still be here to be honored. And we are very proud and very grateful for all of the service you have rendered to the section. And I can also tell you as the executive director, you're not done yet, and I will be calling on you.
Thank you. Absolutely.
So, just this last slide, we have been recording this program, and it will be available on our website. If you are not a member of the surgical section and are not on my email list, please contact me directly, kjtrauma@gmail.com, and I'll make sure you get on the email list. I would recommend that you go to the website, because not only will it have this program, it also has some information that our member Ken Simon has given us about changes in coding and reimbursement. That's going to be elaborated on further. So my last thing is to again thank Dr. Washington, Dr. Adams, Dr. Sutton, and Dr. Cornwell for this incredibly enlightening evening. And I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Henry Tillman again, just for closing remarks.
Again, thank you all. Dr. Cornwell, as Dr. Joseph, thank you for this program. Tonight, we will continue to push forward. Be prepared 2021 surgical section of the National Medical Association, whether it's in person or virtually. It will be a great experience. So I won't keep you any further, but I want to thank everyone for their time tonight. What a blessing, as I always say, and for His grace. Thank you all.
Thank you all. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for attending.
Good night, everybody. Thank you, Dr.
Good
Cornwell.
night.
Thank you, Dr.
Thank you.
Joseph.
Thank you.
Good night.
Good night. Good night, Dr. Cornwell.
Good night.
Thanks, everyone. Stay safe.
Thank you, Dr. McCoy. Dr. Mitchell, I see you waving by. Thank you for attending.
Thanks for a great meeting, Kim. Always good to see you.
Good to see you as well.
Take care.